Good evening. On behalf of King's University College, it's my great pleasure as Associate Dean of Research to welcome you to this evening's Veritas lecture. Before we begin with opening remarks, it is my honor to invite Sydney Brown, a fourth-year student in Social Justice and Peace Studies, to offer a land acknowledgement.
Good evening and welcome to the Kenny Theater here at King's University College. My name is Sydney Brown and I am a fourth-year honors specialization student in Social Justice and Peace Studies. This semester, I have the privilege of working alongside Dr. Allyson Larkin on research examining the polarization of immigrants, refugees, and migrants across the globe. Before we begin tonight's lecture, I would like to acknowledge the land in which we are gathered upon this evening. Western University and King's University College is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron nations. These nations have long-standing and ongoing relationships with the lands and waters of what is now known as southwestern Ontario and the City of London. Acknowledging this land requires more than naming it. It requires recognizing that the displacement of Indigenous peoples is not confined to the past, but is an ongoing structure that continues to shape institutions, borders, and systems of belonging. As many of us gather here as settlers, or as people living within settler colonial structures, we carry a responsibility to confront the ways colonialism continues to inform who is granted safety, mobility, and recognition, and who is not. Let this acknowledgement serve not as a symbolic gesture, but as a reminder of our accountability and our commitment to justice and decolonial learning. As we reflect on reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in this country, we might also consider how this commitment shapes the way we respond to displacement beyond our borders. Reconciliation calls us to confront histories of land depossession, forced migration, and cultural erasure here at home. At the same time, we are living in a world where millions are displaced by war, environmental devastation, economic instability, and growing political tensions. While these contexts are not identical, they are connected through shared histories of colonialism, resource extraction, and political violence. This raises a difficult but necessary question. How do we navigate our responsibilities to the communities we are rooted in, while also maintaining a generous and welcoming heart towards the most vulnerable in our world? Care for local communities and solidarity with displaced peoples are often framed as competing priorities, yet, perhaps, the deeper challenge is learning how to hold both together. Reconciliation calls us to repair relationships here on this land in concrete and accountable ways. At the same time, our shared humanity calls us to resist indifference towards those forced from their homes by violence, climate crisis, economic precarity, and dangerous political instability. To respond faithfully to either requires that we expand our understandings of belonging, responsibility, and moral community. These are not simple tensions, but they are necessary ones if reconciliation and global solidarity are to be meaningful rather than symbolic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sydney, for your words and for inviting us to reflect thoughtfully and critically on our relationship to the land and to one another. The Veritas lecture series invites us into the pursuit of truth. Not truth as an abstraction, but truth grounded in lived realities of human experience. Within the Catholic intellectual tradition, the search for truth is expansive and dialogical. It brings theology, philosophy, social science, and lived experience into conversation. It asks not only what is true, but what is just, what is dignifying, and what serves the common good. Catholic social responsibility, rooted in Catholic social teaching, is one powerful expression of this tradition. It translates moral principles into lived commitments, the dignity of the human person, solidarity across borders, the preferential option for the vulnerable, and care for our common home. Tonight's lecture, Catholic Social Responsibility to Refugees and Migrants, a Global Research Perspective, sits precisely at this intersection of intellectual inquiry and moral responsibility. We're living in a moment of profound global displacement. The question before us is not only how migration is governed, but how communities of conscience respond. What does solidarity mean in practice? How does dignity shape policy? And what responsibilities do institutions, including universities, bear in a world marked by forced migration? At King's, research is not peripheral to these questions. It's central to how we live our mission. King's-led research is animated by our commitments to social justice, ethical action, and community engagement. It brings rigorous scholarship into dialogue with urgent global challenges. We are deeply proud that Dr. Benjamin Muller and Dr. Allyson Larkin are contributing to our Common Home Project, a global collaboration involving more than 50 universities, the Vatican, and non-governmental organizations. This is research that crosses disciplines and borders. It connects local realities with global structures. And it exemplifies how Catholic higher education can contribute meaningfully to conversations about refugees, migrants, and the moral architecture of our shared world. Their work reminds us that Catholic social responsibility is not simply a set of principles. It is ongoing discernment about how to embody justice in changing and very challenging global conditions. This evening invites us into such a discernment. To help guide us in that work, we are extraordinarily fortunate to hear from two scholars whose research exemplifies the very best of King's-led research. It's rigorous, it's globally engaged, and it's deeply committed to human dignity. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers. Dr. Allyson Larkin is Chair and Associate Professor in the Department of Social Justice and Peace Studies at King's University College. She is a scholar of international development and education whose research and teaching focus on cross-cultural conflict, peace building, and the role of humanitarian actors in contexts of displacement and migration. With extensive field experience working alongside international non-governmental organizations in Mexico and Central America, Tanzania, and Uganda, she brings a deeply grounded, practice-informed perspective to her academic work. Her recent research examines humanitarian engagement with migrants in central and southern Italy, as well as the ways conflict and violence shape young people's understandings of peace building and social change. Committed to bridging scholarship and practice, she serves on the Ambassador Advisory Committee for our Common Home Project, co-sponsored by Villanova University and the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development. Dr. Benjamin Muller is Professor of Migration and Border Studies at King's University College and a faculty member at the Center of Theory and Criticism at Western University. His research examines borders, sovereignty, security, and the governance of migration, with particular attention to surveillance technologies, biometrics, and digital border infrastructures. He is the author of Security, Risk, and the Biometric State, Governing Borders and Bodies, which is a foundational text in the study of biometric technologies and migration management. He also co-edited the recent volume Architectures of Security, Design, Control, Mobility, which examines how built environments, infrastructures, and technological systems shape contemporary regimes of mobility and control. More broadly, he has published widely on the political and ethical implications of contemporary border regimes, and his work has informed academic, policy, and international conversations on migration and security. In connection with our Common Home Project, Dr. Muller is engaged in collaborative international research initiatives supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and in partnership with institutions including the Balsillie School of International Affairs and the University of Arizona. His research examines digital borders, human rights, gender equality, and algorithmic justice in migration governance. Please join me in welcoming Drs. Allyson Larkin and Benjamin Muller.
right, thank you so much. Oh, it's rare that I have to do that. I first want to thank King's for allowing us to participate in this. This was for, I think for both of us, but it was a kind of life-changing experience, to be honest. There was an extent to which, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as the talk goes on, that this was unlike any kind of conference I think we had ever attended. And how that is and the details will be fleshed out as we discuss today. This image I took like shortly after we arrived at the conference because we were so enamored by the view that we had, and we were about to eat lunch and that was our view. So it seemed like we were pretty lucky to be a part of that. In terms of what we're going to do tonight, so there's a little shift from this because we decided not to go back and forth. So I'm going to talk for a while, and then Dr. Larkin will talk. Although we will still do all the things that we're advertising we're going to do, we're just not going to go back and forth. So what I'm going to start out by doing is providing a bit of context, because why is it that we would be engaged in a project like this? Why is our common home arising at this particular moment, both in terms of global politics and also in terms of what's going on in Canada in terms of migration and refugees. And then I'll sort of reflect a bit on the experience. And then Dr. Larkin's going to really talk about more of the nuts and bolts of our common home. How did this come about specifically? What is it actually doing? There are a variety of working groups of which we are a part of, and how does it go forward? And I think we're going to end and hopefully have lots of time for discussion afterwards about what we can do as a community here in London and as a community that's part of King's. I think unless you've kind of been living under a rock and haven't turned your TV on, you would have a sense that migration is a major issue today. There are over 300 million people currently migrants in the world. And it's important to recognize that of course, many of those people might just be migrating and accessing immigration policies and states' willingness to accept them on the basis of their skill sets and so on. There are a great many who are on the move because they would rather be at home, but they don't have a choice. They have been forced to leave their homelands, their homes, often in violence, sometimes as a result of climate change, socioeconomic instability, deep socioeconomic instabilities, much of the remnants of the process of colonialism. And this is something that has definitely been on the rise. And it's something that, as we kind of move forward, what we will see is the fact that people have been on the move is not necessarily new, but how they're moving and how states are responding is new. And it's why, in fact, the work of something like our common home is more important, arguably, than it's ever been. It says here, so mid-2025, there are 120 million forcibly displaced persons. It's also important for us to recognize that 95% of the displaced people in the world don't come up in this statistic because they're internally displaced. They also may have left their homes without any want to do so and been under conditions that are truly awful. So I say all that to try to really hammer home how many people are on the move in the world right now. I'm sure you can think of other moments in history in the past 20 years, in the past 50 years, in the past 100 years, where there have also been significant movements of people. But there are some qualitative differences that we're seeing today. And some of those differences are depicted even in this image here. So this image is a photo I took a number of years ago in Nogales, which is a city that is basically cut in half by the US-Mexico border. And this fence was built and razor wire was added to it during Trump's first administration in office. And it speaks to a way in which states increasingly wish to handle people on the move, and that, I would say, is actually by not handling them. And so there's a variety of statistics and numbers that we can look at, in terms of kind of where we're headed with these issues. There we go. So just before I get to the Canadian context, something I think it's important to recognize is that in terms of where people end up, they spend in many cases more than a decade languishing in refugee camps. And that's what's the qualitative change. The fact that people are moving is not different, but the fact that no one would like to deal with them is what's distinctly different. And Canada, like many states around the world, are willing participants in that process. A number of years ago, a scholar from the Balsillie School, Allyson Larkin, wrote a book called The Death of Asylum. That book started with an obituary to asylum. The argument being that the process of asylum itself is effectively over, that states are going to great lengths to avoid ever having to confront someone making a refugee claim. And that's distinctly different. And if you can imagine spending, let's say, 10 or 15 years in a migration camp, when you arrive at the age of 4, the better part of your school life has been spent there. You've been schooled by a UNHCR school, potentially. You have already been subject to a variety of biometric systems that allow you to access that school, that allow you to access food, that a lot of your day-to-day life is governed by international institutions and increasingly a kind of digital mediation of that interaction. It's effectively like living in a prison. It's a form of detention. And if you've paid any attention to the news, you can see that detention is basically what has escalated. The people moving, yes, it has, but maybe not so much as a percentage of population, but the putting them in a holding pattern has. And it's in that kind of context that something like Our Common Home comes. Now, something that I wanted to talk about specifically in the lead up to this is, and I think we all do this, and if we think of even current news that's going on about Mexico and so on, I think there's a habit for many, and Canadians in particular, to imagine that these problems are somehow somewhere else. So particularly when we live next door to a country like the United States, it's easy for us to look there and say, oh wow, things are really terrible. Look at the issues that they have with potentially how they're mismanaging immigration, the ways in which they're managing their border, and so on. But we have our own issues. I've got two images here to kind of give a sense of sort of where we're at here. The image on the top, I would imagine people might remember. So in 2015, under the Trudeau government, we accepted 100,000 refugees from Syria. I think this was, at that time, something that by and large Canadians were in support of. And it demonstrated, it was a bold stance in a sense. There were a few nations in the world that were willing to take a stance like that, and we were among them. The image on the bottom, I think, is probably less known to people, potentially. This is the Roxham Road border crossing. Now, it maybe doesn't look that official in the image, but as somewhat official as it might look, that's actually not a border crossing. That's not an official port of entry along our border. And in 2017, such large numbers of people began trying to cross our border at that point from the United States into Canada, it emerged as a sort of quasi-permanent crossing. And the reason for that is something called the Safe Third Country Agreement with the United States. Now, the word safe is really critical here. The claim being that if one enters the United States and then wishes to come to Canada and claim asylum, they cannot, because they already are in the United States, which is a safe third country. Now, I don't know, again, if you've been paying attention to what's been going on in the world, but I think there's cause to say that that's no longer the case. And there was definitely cause to say that in 2017. It's no surprise that this border became incredibly busy in 2017, because January of 2017 is when President Trump's first term began. And there was an understanding that that was not a safe place to be. And at that moment, we still had a loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement. So this is something that had been signed into law a long time ago, but there was a loophole that it would not apply if you were not crossing at an official crossing point. And so it allowed for this to occur. So this was a kind of We could say a window of grace at Roxham Road that occurred. Now, that kind of goes on for some time, makes the news, it's all over, and I want to make sure I get my date right here on when things change, because it's 2023 that we tighten that up. We tighten up the Safe Third Country Agreement, Roxham Road is taken down, and that part of the agreement no longer applies. And again, why is that happening? Well, we see Trump's second term on the horizon, and a lot of discussion of our border and the need to strengthen our border and look favorably in the eyes of the United States in terms of how we manage that border. But in many cases, this has been devastating. And it's something that I think we don't hear very much of. We hear a lot more about tariffs. We hear a lot more about whether the ketchup we're buying is made in the United States. But we don't seem as mobilized about something like this, which is we are in fact turning people back to a country that I would argue many people in our government don't believe is a safe third country. I mean, I don't want to put charts and tables up, but I did anyways, to try to highlight some of the shifts that we see here. There's some really significant moments. So this is enforced removals. I mean, Canada usually does a good job of creating euphemistic language for things that are worse. So we don't have a no-fly list, it's called passenger protect. This is not called a deportation list, it's called enforced removals. It sounds a little bit more palatable. As you can tell, those numbers escalate significantly. In other words, Canada is deporting a significant number of people, and it is something that has gone up. And what's also important about that is the reason for those deportations. Over 80% are effectively related to safe third country agreement deportations. In other words, because people are trying to flee the United States, believing that they are in jeopardy, and we are saying, sorry, we have an agreement, you have to go back. And I raise this again to kind of highlight how immediate the concerns of something like our common home is to us here. This isn't just about somewhere else. And in fact, it's very immediate even in our own communities. We have people graduating high school in London who came here from the Ukraine, who, if they want to come here, they're going to have to pay international student fees. So these are realities of the migrant community, both in Canada and even in London, that I think it's important for us to think about that context when we think about why it is we would want to participate in something like this, why we have, and kind of where we go from here. So we went there, and I thought I would, yes, there is a flashy photo up there. That's intentional. So as part of our time there, we did get a chance to have an audience with the Pope, which was pretty incredible, and we'll talk about some of these things later. But something that I really want to underscore is that this event that involved over 50 different universities, advocacy groups, and so on, the way in which people were on the same page. We had a talk at dinner, and a student had mentioned that, she brought an issue up in a class and thought, well, everybody kind of understands that that's the way this is, and then sort of felt a pushback on that. And I think sometimes we're puzzled when we say, like, well, of course you should extend support and grace to these people. And then there's someone pushes back, and we're like, well, wait a minute, how can you be thinking that? And those kind of things didn't happen here. Everyone recognized what the challenges are that we face, and everyone was willing in really, I think we'll talk about a bit later, but in really incredible ways to work towards those aims in ways that I haven't seen at a conference before, particularly at a conference that's in an attractive place like Rome. It's not as if like leaving the conference early would be really awful because of what's outside the door, but that didn't happen. And so I think that's really critical. So I'm not going to say more about like the experience, because I think it's important for Allyson to provide the context in that, and then I think we'll kind of informally talk a little bit more about experience.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here this evening and to be part of this lecture series and to be able to share with you some pieces of my research, but more than that, maybe why I was so excited to be part of this kind of a project. And when it came up and Rob sent an email to me and suggested, do you think that there's a way for us to get Kings involved in this? I think I probably wrote back at 2 o'clock in the morning. I was like, yes, very good. I'm applying right now. We're going to be there. So to say that I was enthused to be a part of this, it was kind of, I guess, the way I approach a lot of things in my life when I get excited. But this one turned out to be, in the end, even so much more than I had hoped for it to be. And so I do just want to also say, first of all, so thank you to Rob. Thank you to Mark and Aaron for the beautiful introduction. Thank you so much. And just for the extraordinary support that I have always felt for my work and my research, and to be able to teach in the Social Justice and Peace Studies program here. And to all you students who are here, you are the ones that are the hope and really keep that passion and spirit alive for me. So tonight, what I'd like to do is, my contribution to this conversation is I'd like to talk a little bit about the origin story to our common home narrative, and within that to share a bit of my own trajectory that led me to be a part of this project, and then to open up some questions for why I think this is a particular moment of not only responsibilities, but possibilities and opportunities for Catholic universities specifically to be a voice and a space where these difficult conversations that often can't be had in the public sphere at a time of misinformation and polarization. And I will get to that a lot more later. And so I hope that that is a conversation that we can start tonight and continue as we move on into the future. So the origin story of our common home and my own research and teaching are both rooted in the refugee and migrant crisis, which was intensifying across Europe in 2015. I know that it is an age-old crisis, and that it's something that had been growing, and those of us who have been working in the global south and studying migration and displacement are aware of that. But I'm going to start it tonight in 2015. At that time, Pope Francis was still a relatively new pope. But right from the beginning, he made an awareness of and a responsibility toward refugees and migrants a centerpiece of his pontificate and theology. On this first slide, we have a picture of the sculpture Angels Unawares, which is a sculpture that was done by Canadian artist Timothy Schmaltz. He also did the Homeless Jesus sculpting bronze casting that is in front of our library. And this one was commissioned by Pope Francis, and it is a boat carrying refugees to who knows where, but it's not just refugees to Europe, and they are refugees from throughout the ages. And so it really is kind of this historic representation that migration, displacement is part of the human condition, that it is not a new phenomenon, although sometimes the way that it is characterized within news media or something as a crisis may make it appear that way. In this sculpture, there are also representations of the parents of Canadian Cardinal Michael Cherney, who obviously is a cardinal, but is someone who also has deeply influenced me since I was a student at Fordham University, a Jesuit university in New York. Father Cherney has been a tireless commitment to social justice, working in Africa during the AIDS crisis, volunteering to take the place of a Jesuit at the University of Central America when 5 of his confreres were assassinated in 1988. And he is now the prefect for the Dicastery of Integral Human Development, which is one of the co-sponsors of the Our Common Home project. Many of you will also remember that Pope Francis's first trip as Pope was to Lampedusa, which is a small island off the coast of Sicily and is the arrival point for many migrants and refugees who successfully navigate the dangerous crossing of the Mediterranean, and unfortunately also the place where many of the empty boats or pieces of boats wash up when there's been an accident at sea. 2015 was one of the deadliest years for irregular crossings of the Mediterranean, but unfortunately that number has not decreased. 10 years later, 2025, the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, estimates that 25 people died per day in attempts to cross the Mediterranean. And at this stage, 2026 is actually tracking to be one of the deadliest years on record. So while there's a growing migration crisis in Europe and a simultaneous rise in anti-immigrant political rhetoric, fueling extreme political parties across the continent, in Canada in 2015, we were in an election year, and we were not immune to many of these discourses. And so I'd like to maybe just remind people of a few of the things that were taking place then. There were several candidates taking strong stances against immigration. Some of the highlights from that time include a barbaric cultural practices hotline that was set up where citizens could report what they believed to be unacceptable behavior. There were suggestions that we tighten requirements for citizenship and asylum seekers through more difficult tests, and the idea of old stock Canadians was regularly floated in political speeches. And it's in this context that in 2017, I was traveling to a conference for international development and education that was taking place in Budapest, Hungary. All summer, there had been reports of a huge surge of migrants landing on the coast of the Greek islands and seeking to migrate through Europe to northern European countries, particularly Germany, Sweden, France, and Great Britain. Late summer that year was a particularly intense moment for the crisis. And so this is where I kind of, a lot more of the migrant crisis came home to me in a way that, when I look back now, seems very, very transformational. On the morning of September 3rd, I was on a train to Budapest for this conference when a notification popped up on my phone from the Globe and Mail. It was a photo of a little boy, Alan Kurdi. He had drowned with his younger brother and his mother while crossing the Mediterranean. The photo was devastating, and I hope you don't mind, but I would like to share it with you tonight. The revelation that the boy's family had recently been denied asylum here, even with the family having an established extended family in Canada, shifted the political fortunes of that current election. And in a rare political moment of benevolence toward refugees, the Liberals won a strong majority in Parliament on that promise of, at that point, welcoming only 25,000 refugees, but ultimately welcoming in excess of 100,000. Upon arriving at the Kaleti rail station in Budapest, I encountered a different situation. The station was in a police and military lockdown with thousands of migrants, families, children, elderly, and youth and disabled. Almost every square inch of this huge rail station was filled with migrants, primarily from Syria, but also Afghanistan and other sites throughout the Middle East and North Africa. And although my stay in the station was not as long as theirs, it was only about 9.5 hours, I know that for many more, it was well more than a day with little access to food and services. 48 hours later, I left Budapest on a bus, as the train station was still not operational, and we crawled along a highway that was so filled with migrants, families, children, elderly, disabled, walking toward the Austrian border. It was surreal to watch in real time what I had seen, smaller scale in times in other places in the world, but never anything like this. The origin story of Our Common Home has similar roots, but takes place a few years later. Michel Piston, who was a law professor at Villanova University and founder of the Mother Cabrini Institute on Immigration, received the inspiration for the Our Common Home initiative when in 2022, she was at a conference at the Gregorian University in Rome, and Pope Francis was a keynote speaker. In this talk, he called on Catholic universities to devote more resources to research, teaching, and social promotion of migrants and refugees. I'm just going to move you off of that slide for a bit. The idea for Our Common Home came in a conversion moment for Michelle, as she tells it, who had been working as an immigration lawyer and advocate and activist for years. As Michelle tells her story, she was in the front row, and she felt as if he was speaking directly to her, prompting a personal call to be part of the solution to the immigration and migration crisis. The result is a multi-year project designed to engage researchers, activists, civil society leaders in a multi-year project to increase awareness and to provide spaces for refugees in higher education. And in this, it aligns with the United Nations Sustainability Goals and UNESCO's call for universities to create spaces for 15% of migrants by the year 2030. So, and I think that the most important piece here is that this program is building on a framework, a conceptual framework that was developed by Pope Francis to align the systemic issues that have created a global indifference to migrants and refugees, and with a response, the concept of a culture of encounter. And I think now is where we kind of transition into why this initiative is an important moment for Catholic universities and talking about what our social responsibilities are toward people who have been forcibly displaced. In his apostolic letter, published in October of this year, Drawing New Imaginaries of Hope, Pope Leo acknowledges that we live in a complex, fragmented, digitalized educational environment, and that Catholic higher education has a particular role to play in resisting and enacting programs and pedagogies to resist the dehumanizing forces that threaten to consume our humanity. This letter builds on the two concepts that I mentioned developed by Pope Francis that speak to both the effects of this environment, of polarization, demonization of immigrants and migrants, but it's hopeful too, because of the way he conceptualizes the response to this program through cultures of encounters with migrants and refugees. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about the globalization of indifference first, to kind of establish what that piece looks like, and then also talk a little bit about what a culture of encounter might look like and how that opens up possibilities for us within the context of our own campus and others. So the first piece that I think is really important, I'm just going to backtrack for 1 minute. Is that okay? Because I just thought of something that really relates to this. It's important. In alignment with my experiences in Hungary and subsequent work with migrant and refugee groups in Europe, we were able to establish an experiential learning group program at a youth center for human rights and peace building in Arezzo, Italy, The center's name is called Rondine. I won't go into all the wonderful, juicy details of it, but what I think was really one of the most important pieces out of that was we established a relationship with the section for migrants and refugees at the Vatican. We would visit, we would hear from people working within that section. It was a new initiative that was sponsored by Pope Francis. And what was really fascinating to me was that students did not realize that there was actually a political wing to the Vatican that was very, very engaged in exercising a very strong soft power, and particularly policy briefs that were countering some of these anti-immigrant and anti-migrant narratives that were really the dominant voice across much of Europe at this time, and continue to be. So I think one of the things that's important with this notion of the globalization of indifference is that indifference has become systemic. Francis argues that indifference is no longer just personal. It has become cultural and global, and we have become accustomed to the suffering of others. This isn't a new notion, I know, in the academic literature and everything, but I think that hearing it from the Pope is a really powerful acknowledgement that this is a systemic and structural issue. It doesn't affect me, it's far away, it's none of my business. And all too often, I think we're able to feel that way in the context of Canada because we are effectively surrounded by a moat, big oceans, and a border where, as Ben acknowledged, most people that show up irregularly here are deported back to the U.S. Those who are able to come through a regular migration pattern have been the most vetted and the most, cleared people in the world, mostly years after having spent years in a refugee camp. He goes on to talk about a throwaway culture where people are treated as disposable, migrants, the elderly, the poor, economic systems that prioritize profit over persons, and human beings that have become statistics rather than faces. There's dehumanization through language, which we are hearing again as the anti-immigration rhetoric ramps up again in a couple of our provinces here, when migrants are reduced and described as flows, waves, problems, invasions, swarms, burdens. We reduce people to abstract categories, and indifference grows when we stop seeing faces and human stories. And that we have, one of the final points I want to make is that indifference is both personal and structural. That personal in that it involves a failure of our individual compassion, and structural in that it is embedded in political, economic, and social systems. The antidote, hopefully, and this is where I find the program for our common home to really be rooted in, is encounters and solidarity. For Francis, globalization itself is not the problem. Rather, it must be humanized. The culture of encounter is a change of attitude toward migrants and refugees that is required on the part of everyone, moving away from attitudes of defensiveness and fear, indifference and marginalization, typical of a throwaway culture, toward attitudes based on encounter, the only culture that will be capable of building a more just and fraternal world. Encounters require drawing near. Francis often reflects on the Good Samaritan who sees a wounded man. He's moved by compassion for this man. He approaches him with care and takes responsibility for his well-being. Tolerance says, I allow you to exist, but an encounter says, I want to know you. An encounter involves listening to stories, engaging in genuine dialogue, participating in mutual learning, and being open to being changed. It is relational, not abstract. It has social and political implications, and this concept is not only spiritual, it will reshape how our societies function. For example, in public policy, a culture of encounter would encourage dialogue over polarization, inclusion over exclusion, integration over segregation, and policies rooted in dignity rather than fear. And it will require humility, that we do not have all of the answers. Oops, I might have just forgotten to move on to that one, but let's do this one. Okay. So I'll briefly give just a little more information about the particular project and what we've accomplished so far, and then we'd like to go to a little bit more of a dialogic kind of setup here. We started our Common Home last spring with a series of online meetings, and the Rome conference was the first time that we were able to come together as a whole. More than 250 Catholic universities were represented at our first meeting in Rome, and more than 175 more representatives from civil society and activist groups were also there. Our initiative and our mission is grounded in the following principles. We want to mobilize universities and community partners to address displacement through informed, coordinated action. We want to recognize the moral and practical imperative to respond to the global displacement of refugees with compassion and systemic solutions. We're drawing inspiration from Pope Leo XIV's call to shared responsibility, hope, and reconciliation with refugees, and to build capacity for compassionate systems change, inviting institutions to rethink structures and to work collectively across difference. And I think this last piece is really important for us to consider now as we're in a time of austerity and reframing and restructuring of our universities. And one of the things that I've noticed here at King's and I see it at other universities in conversation with other colleagues is the decline in the number of refugees who are attending university. We used to have a really kind of a thriving sponsorship program here, co-sponsored through the parish and our campus ministry, and it was something that faculty became deeply engaged with, both as sponsors for some of the refugees and mentors for them as well. And I think that this is a real call to, in this moment of crisis, to rethink how are we responding and how are we going to prioritize the way that we create space for refugees on our campus. And I think what Ben mentioned about, the Ukrainian refugees, what happens to families who are admitted as refugees, and until they can get permanent resident status, their children can attend public school. But once you graduate at grade 12, if you don't have permanent residency, you are classified as an international student. And so it makes accessing a university education impossible. The fees are extraordinary. I should have checked what they are, but I believe that they're in excess of $45,000 right now. And so this is a huge problem, but not insurmountable if we prioritize it. We have divided into different working groups. I'll be really quick on this because this could get a little bit boring, but we've got a teaching stream, a research stream, an advocacy stream, and a service stream. So both Ben and I are involved in the teaching stream. And what I think is really exciting there is that we're developing a global migration academy where we can share teaching modules, syllabi, case studies, and data resources across institutions. This is really important. This is important because we need to be able to draw from one another and to draw strength that is not only for institutional credibility, but can also work as as leverage for political and social change. And I'm sure that you can only think right now about what's happening with ICE in the United States and colleagues that I know who are working on campuses where ICE has apprehended students and taking them into detention. And it's happening in high schools and elementary schools. My closest personal connection to that is a sister who teaches in an inner city Denver elementary school, and they have lost over 164 students now since the beginning of the year. Primarily, they have self-deported because they are absolutely terrified of what will happen to them if they end up in detention. So it's very, very real, and I think that for myself as a researcher and a teacher, I want to make that really palpable for students, but not in a scary way, but in a proactive, and for them to be able to understand how solidarities and building these kinds of networks can make us resilient to the kinds of forces that would continue to demonize and exclude refugees and migrants from participation, full participation, which is absolutely a critical principle of Catholic social teaching. So I think I'm going to leave it there for now, and we're going to move into a little bit of a conversation, and happy to take any and all questions. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you all for being here and hearing about our experiences there.
There's all kinds of awesome students here, so surely
Yes.
you have something to ask. Not that that precludes anyone else from asking a question.
Hi, Claire.
Hi, thank you both so much, first of all, for your presentation. Sorry, my name is Claire Gain. I'm a professor in social justice and peace studies as well. But I think this is just such a phenomenal example of research being used for social change and folks coming together, not just from academia, but from the community, folks with lived experiences, folks who are impacted on the ground themselves, to utilize academia and all the knowledge that so many academics and community leaders have to create something that is meaningful and hopefully can actually make some change. So thank you. My question is for both of you, I guess, but you mentioned about the UNESCO goal of 15% of students at post-secondary being refugees or migrants. You also mentioned, the extraordinary costs of post-secondary, and we know that this is at a time when post-secondary is heavily underfunded, specifically in Ontario, but all across Canada and largely globally as well. So what would this look like? Like, how could we enact this? Of course, it's incredibly important, but it's looking like we just don't have the funds to do it. So any thoughts on how this could become a reality? Thank you.
Thanks so much. You want me to start? I have some ideas. Well, I think it does take resources. And I think that there are probably ways that we can look to more models similar to the sponsorship program that we had for refugees, really prior to COVID. That seems that COVID kind of killed that, that program within this particular community. I also am really proud of our students who have been working very hard through this King's Student Council to bring back the WUSC program, which is the World University Students. I can never remember what the C is, but that also was a program that we had here at King's prior to 2020 when COVID hit. And so I'm really, really hopeful that we'll be able to bring that back. And that is where students really contribute to, through their student fees, to funds that help to support, and then those funds are matched by WUSC to bring in a refugee student. There are myriad ways. I really believe this. I think one of the biggest is choosing not to classify refugee students as international students. And I know that in my conversations with people, I've been told, well, Western sets that designation. But I think that there is starting to be movement on that front because there has been a big pushback, in particular this year, from students who are Ukrainian that graduated from CCH. They were extraordinary students, 4.0 average, so promising. But they couldn't come up with, $60,000 a year to pay for a science education at Western. We make choices. We prioritize a lot of things in the university, and we put a lot of money into it. My particular preference is usually into students. Profs and faculty are awesome. Infrastructure is awesome, but I'm a big advocate for investing in students. So I would, if I was on the priorities and planning committee, that's what you'd be getting from me.
I get, okay, so I'm on that committee. But something I will say, like related to being on that committee, is the precise point that there are always choices to make, and none of the choices are easy. But like we could be making different choices, and that everything potentially could be a battle, and battles aren't easy, but they're often worth fighting. And so I think, you know, it's often. Maybe this goes to the wider community as well, but I mean, people often will, like to have their names on buildings, but do they like to have their names on something that sponsors migrant students, that is doing great things for our community, for the world? And I think that's part of it as well, right? There's a whole kind of ecology around this. I mean, this is one of the points of something like the Veritas lecture, is to remind everyone that this isn't just an island here. This is part of this community. It's a major employer in this community, and it's also here to care and support its own significant community that goes out into the community. Our students are incredibly active socially in the world around us, doing wonderful things while they're students, not only when they finish. And so I think, you know, we maybe need to also pitch it that way, that this is something that the whole community should be caring about and helping all of us to collectively figure out how can we make more space and make this happen. Because it's not also only Kings that benefits from that either, it's all of us. I mean, that's something that came out in the conference that, I mean, I don't always like to think about it in these kinds of very like strategic terms, but it was raised that we're talking about a huge pool of people who have amazing talents and skills that we're closing a door to. And that's to our detriment.
Yes, Dennis.
Well, thank you for your presentation. It's inspirational and hopeful.
Good.
My question has to do with the Common Home, or the project. Has there been any research or talk or discussion of friendship? In other words, one-on-one making friends. Because some of what I hear in our parishes, I'm Catholic priest, I'm the rector at the seminary. Sometimes what I hear in some parishes is that some of the immigrants, migrants, are unto their own as we're unto our own. And sometimes there's practices of wanting to engage them, but not including them. Mm-hmm. But I'm also more interested in the issue of friendship. Any research, any discussion of making friends?
Can I just jump in? Can you hear? Okay. So I have two answers for you there. The first one is, I think that I can speak to the context of the university, right? I think that there's enormous, is there research? Okay. I think there is really research, if not specifically on friendship, on relationship building and how critical that is. And I know that especially through the Rondonnet seminar, there is a body of research there, because that is really founded around the notion of how do we learn to live with our enemy, and how do we learn to engage with the other and to tell our story together with the other. And I think that has been a really powerful model for our students to engage with, to see Israeli and Palestinian youth and Lebanese youth and Russian and Ukrainian youth and, you know, Balkans, Albanians and Bosnians and Kosovans. Did I say that wrong? Kosovars, thank you. You know, but I think you're exactly right, Dennis, that is a huge challenge to break through some of those cultural barriers that exist. I know that at the London Cross-Cultural Learner Center, that they bring in groups of Londoners, all different backgrounds and everything, to be kind of mentors with newly arrived families, both refugee and immigrants. And so I think that's the only way we're really going to thrive. One of the things that makes me very nervous in London is the lack of a broader network. Like the Cross-Cultural Learner Center operates on a shoestring budget and doesn't have the resources that we need, because we're an arrival center for migrants in the London region. So when you see things in the news like the Remigrate movement, and we were talking at dinner about, you know, the Turning Point chapter, that's the Charlie Kirk group opening in London, I think we're in a tricky space here, right? We need more opportunities for friendship, and then I think you're exactly right. We need to do more research on exactly what's happening in our community.
Yeah, and something I would say, so first of all, we know this with students, right? If students are engaged in more things outside of the classrooms, they tend to be more successful. And so we do actually, in that sense, have data that shows direct kind of one-to-one community engagement in that way creates success. And so opening up that opportunity for refugees is going to help that. I mean, the other point I would say is, you know, how are we going to effectively approach the question of reconciliation and truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada? It's the same thing. It's not going to be accomplished successfully with like grand, you know, conferences and so on. It's about one-to-one engagement, and this is the same point. I mean, reconciliation is a distinct part of this project, and that only happens one-on-one. And so I think you're right to look there, because that is where it needs to happen. But again, we have a context here where that's kind of how this community thrives and works at a college. So I think it's a natural environment for that.
My question's a little bit abstract and doesn't I hope it does. I think there's a lot of things that have to just practically be done to meet the moment. But I'm wondering if either of you could speak to the possibility that the category of refugee has perhaps backfired on us a little bit. And I think about some studies that I did, I'm a historian, years and years ago, of a period in the 1890s where there was 50% unemployment in industrial cities like Hamilton and Cleveland and others. And in Cleveland in the 1890s, there was a 5-year depression from 1893 to 1898. With that incredible difficulty, there were 1,000 people coming off the train every day from primarily 3 areas. They were coming from Italy, they were coming from the Baltic states, primarily Jews from the Baltic states escaping violence, but also African Americans from the South that were flowing into Cleveland. And they didn't come under any kind of status. It was just that the state really couldn't stop them from moving. And they were moving for a whole different set of reasons. But probably the majority, even with these terrible stories that we know about from these places, to just seek work. And that's why most people, so the 300 million people on the road, you know, this is just the structure of global capitalism. Is there any way to get outside of the refugee conversation, use it for now, protect people now, but to establish, is there any way to get back to the drawing board? Because it's there in the concept of a common home, is it not? Which is the global world, if I should say the global capitalist world, can be defined by the free movement of 4 things. Services, money, goods, and people. The goods are being stopped, right? No one's going to stop the flow of money, right? Because the people that depend upon that have all the power. And of these 4, the goods are being stopped to some degree, but it's the people that are really being gone after. But they all mutually imply each other. And they're not moving for a holiday. They're moving, regardless of if they meet refugee status. When my family and I came to Canada 25 years ago, it wasn't for a holiday, and I was extraordinarily privileged, but it was for a better job. Just seems, is there any traction can we get to a point where the justification for crossing a border, you don't need to be a refugee. There just happens to be no place on earth that you can be where you don't belong.
What did Simone Weil say? That never has there been a nation founded on love. So I think maybe that's my response, and just a quick note to you. But I mean, I agree with you, Pat, and I think that's what, I mean, ultimately, I think that's in the ideal that we need to get to. The flip of what you're asking raises a lot of concerns for me in relation to AI and what is going to happen to refugees and migrants as more and more work is automated and more people, fewer people are really needed in the labor force. I'm a little bit under the influence right now of Yuval Noah Harari, who's talking about, a useless class in the future. But I think that it's going to be at the discursive level to change the way that we view refugees as not someone who, they steal our jobs, as Noam Chomsky would say. But that's going to be really, really difficult in the current technological verse that we live in.
Yeah, I mean, you're on the right track, Pat. I mean, that's what ultimately has to happen. I mean, Harsha Walia, who's a Canadian academic and advocate, has said, like, we don't have a migration crisis, we have a border crisis. The crisis is the way in which we focus on the border as being some kind of solution to something. And I mean, you can go down that route, and there is now a rich literature on border abolitionism, which is, I mean, I think some people that is like a scary thought, but it's because maybe we just haven't given it enough thought. And we haven't given thought to the fact that we need to normalize mobility in these ways. You're absolutely right. Mobility is, I mean, the 4 freedoms you mentioned are the 4 freedoms of the European Union. Like, those are like foundational to how the EU is constructed. And I think for the most part, we would look to the EU and say, oh, this thing's pretty successful. But even the EU is like a fortress to those who are trying to get in from the outside, and particularly if you're trying to cross the Mediterranean. And so I agree, one of our problems is refugee as a category is completely outdated, because it's itself beholden to a very post-World War II context. And so, I mean, at this particular moment, the largest number of refugees in the world are climate refugees. So they can't claim refugee status. States are aware that if they've signed the Refugee Convention, they might actually have to hear someone's case, and so that's why we're doing everything we can to stall them everywhere. So, I mean, in Canada's case, one of the most effective ways we do this is we've outsourced the visa processing system to private actors who are increasingly using AI, and people are languishing in camps and then going through this kind of complex, faceless process. So we're all doing that, but yeah, in the meantime, like, this is normal, and this isn't going to decrease, particularly as climate change doesn't kind of seem to be turning around. So we do have to normalize that. But the only way I think we're going to succeed in that, and that's kind of goes to Allison's first point, is we have to question, like, our own sovereignty. And I think, like, in Canada, that ought to be easy, because we've lived a lie for a really long time in terms of what that's based on, and we're starting slowly to pull the threads of how it's been premised on the dispossession of land and the displacement and destruction of peoples. And maybe as we kind of pull that thread a little more, we'll realize, wait a minute, we could actually do something altogether different here. I would argue we're either going to have to confront that in a meaningful way and in a more controlled way, or we're going to be forced to confront it, because these numbers aren't going to decline. If you look at climate projections of where will be the most hospitable parts of the world in the next 50 years, well, like, we're living in part of it. And so where are people going to come? They're going to come here. So we have to figure it out. And I think it relates to Dennis's point. We need to figure out how to talk to each other and see the humanity in one another.
Can I add one point, and then Deb? And I didn't talk about this, and I probably should have mentioned it, but a big piece of our common home, too, is the right not to migrate, right? The right to stay home. And what is the responsibility? There's a huge discussion in this conference about the responsibilities of the global north, Canada, resource-rich countries, to be much more responsive to climate displacement and to the impact that our corporations and our day-to-day activities are having. I'm actually really mad at myself right now as I was preparing this. And I was in my mind to really foreground that this was a conference built around the Global South participants. They were the lead voices. And it was really what we took away to learn from them about what the experience for refugees are. And although tonight I kind of focused on, my journey, the journey of this program, and the context of Canadian universities, if I had kept my focus a little more on the broad picture, I would have emphasized that. And, there's this beautiful poem by a Somali refugee poet, and I'm sorry I can't remember her name, but the title of the poem will stay with you. You only leave home when home is the mouth of a shark, and when you have nowhere else to go, and where everything is burning down around you, and when you are ripping your passport to shreds so that you can say, I have no paper and I am so vulnerable, please allow me to be a refugee in your wonderful country. It's a devastating process, and so I think that piece, the right not to migrate, that people have a right to stay home. I'm like you, Pat. I migrated to Canada with a wonderful job. But I know I come from an immigrant family where it was not wonderful, and it was forced migration. And that haunted my grandparents and my parents. And I think that is the biggest question there. How do we create a world where this is not the question, how to manage people who have been forcibly displaced?
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. It's been great as usual. We learned so much from both of you. Definitely this is a scary time for immigrants. Well, here, just, the Bill C-12 just passed recently. Cuts with immigration services. I think in Toronto, 50% of people that are working with immigrant services are going to be laid off. So there's less and less. So it's a scary time for immigrants, definitely. And what's happening right now in the States, we just had a conversation last night with someone from the University of Chicago, and they were saying, the situation with the Somali community is being really difficult all over. So we were having all those conversations. So for immigrants, definitely seeing an initiative like this coming from the Vatican, it is hopeful. An institution that has, this possibility to touch, different places and different sectors. My question is, what is the next steps of these initiatives, and if you're thinking to bring this locally, that people can join or people can, in a way, contribute to it. That is my question.
Are you volunteering, Deb? I know you are. I know you are. I think absolutely. I mean, I think in my heart of hearts that that's the way I see myself right now. I've had a fantastic career. I've just been able to do so many things, and just working with this group, it's kind of inspired me, I think, coming out of COVID, so what am I going to do with this research, these experiences now? I love teaching. I love every aspect, actually, of my job. It's a little ridiculous, my children would tell you. But I would love to see that happen. I think that Ben and I both are, we're talking all the time about what are the next steps, how are we going to find resources to continue. There are a number of meetings regionally that will be taking place across the world where I would like to be able to participate in. But locally, I think that we really need to have that conversation on our campus, because the refugee population in London is largely invisible. Once they leave high school, they're invisible. And I think that this mirrors the experience of Indigenous youth. Right? So we have really two fronts we need to work on if we're going to truly decolonize our university and to not kind of hunker down and just I know balancing the books is really, really important, but I think that we have the capacity to do more. We can do both. We can become more efficient with the resources we have, but I truly believe that getting a broad, coalition, advisory group together that can really, look at different models for what other universities are doing, I think, could work toward doing more. I'm saying this carefully. I don't want anybody to think I'm being too critical of King's, because I think King's has been amazing, but I think that we can and we must do more.
Yes, hello. Thank you for the presentation. And I serve one of the ministries for migrant workers ministry. So when we talk about migrants, we always think about people that stay here, right? But in Canada, there is a big number of migrant workers where they come to work, seasonal work for 8 months or sometimes 2 years. They come by themselves, no family. So I have here my wonderful group of volunteers. With the Diocese of London, the Catholic Church, we serve 7 regions. And when I'm thinking about that, I hear about being friends. I think it's important to recognize that these communities are among us, that migrant workers or migrants in general are part of our communities, and welcome them as they are part of our communities. Build a community for them. With my wonderful volunteers, and I think every community can have wonderful volunteers like them, raise money, involve them in the community, don't make them invisible. And for me, more in the university level, I always wonder about the children of these migrant workers, they come, they spend so many years here. Is there any opportunities for these children to become maybe scholarships within universities, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are that's what we need to be doing, and I think that the points are connected as well. I mean, something that we found when we were there, participating in this, is also hearing some of the amazing, innovative things going on at other places. And that's part of the benefit to being in a room with people from all these different institutions around the world. And some of them have done amazing things in terms of creating small kind of advocacy programs to help even within the student body to be aware of organizations like this and get students more involved in these programs. Advocating and supporting people through the legal system in these contexts. One doesn't need to be a lawyer for that. So I think there's a lot of other initiatives we can do to help beyond obviously things like scholarships for sure. But you're also, I mean, temporary foreign workers in Canada have for a long time been very invisible. And I think like COVID, there was a moment where it seemed it suddenly made people aware for unfortunate reasons, but people became aware of it. And I think we maybe have lost a lot of that awareness again, and we need to remind people again that this is actually like essential. This is where our food security comes from. These are members of our community, really critical members of our community, and so we should be welcoming and participating with them instead of treating them like invisible.
And first of all, I want to say thank you very much for raising the challenges for migrant workers in our region, because yes, they are invisible. When I moved here, I can remember visiting Dresden and meeting with people who were working as volunteers there. And it was another one of those, why aren't we talking about this, in terms of how can we support, how can we be a liaison of some sort. I think that, and that was just before COVID. Again, that's kind of like another great rupture in a lot of the conversations that were happening along those lines with universities. But I don't know, to more directly answer your question, I don't know what opportunities there are for children of migrant workers. I know that with the London District Catholic School Board, again, before COVID, I did some work with principals at St. Thomas More School off of Sarnia, where there was a large population of children attending that school. But I don't know what the opportunities are, but I will look into it. Okay?
Thank you very much. It's really great to see that it is not only in AI and other technologies that research is being done, but research in refugees and migrants. Thank you very much. I have, first of all, something I would like to run by you, a question to just check on my understanding. And then I have a comment. When we hear the numbers of people on the move, 300 million, etc., and we see how the whole world is reacting to it, and it is in the news and everywhere. I have a question, and I'm not sure if I am right or wrong, but this is not more than, it is not even 4% of the international population, which means that more than 96% they are in their homes. They are not moving. It is, to me, insignificant. This is not what should move politicians and communities to be against the people of the move. And if I am not wrong, I think it is the attitude that is changing towards refugees and migrants. And I would like to ask, what has changed, is causing the closing of the borders and inventing the robot dogs and scanning eyes to do everything to stop people from moving, while it is not really a big issue. I'm not sure if to minimize that in terms of numbers is right, but I would like to have your comment on it. The second thing is just a comment that, like my colleague Azwani, I work also for the Diocese of London. And the Roman Catholic Diocese of London, here where we are, we have an agreement with the Canadian government to sponsor refugees. Just for those who might not know, that even if it is a drop in the sea, but we do something. And I just wanted to say that we are actually about to launch a campaign about this particular program where the government partners with any sponsoring group that can be church-based group or non-church-based group, where the partners in terms of sharing the financial responsibilities, and then the sponsoring group can take care of the integration part. King's Parish has done a good job, yep. And very soon we'll be going to groups that have done this in the past, and those who have not done that, just to let you know that we can do that little part, and I appreciate that if there is a follow-up you would like, we can schedule a time to come and discuss this, how we can do that drop in the sea.
That would be great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll make brief comments because I feel like I've been speaking a lot, but to your first question, why are we closing borders and why are we demonizing immigrants? I don't think that there's a fulsome, easy answer, but I do think that that the easiest answer that I can give to you right now is that fear is a particularly powerful political emotion, and that fear of the other has been used for millennia. It is something deeply embedded in, for lack of a better term, the human condition. And I think that when it is allowed to be cultivated in a way that now is almost beyond truly understanding through technologies, social medias, algorithms, all of these things. We talk a lot about how siloed we are. My algorithms don't match the algorithms of my children or of many of my students. And I think that, unfortunately, racist and economic and violent tropes are now attributed to a threat that immigrants and migrants pose to everything from stealing jobs to, killing pets in Ohio, and to, operating, well, I guess that was Hillary Clinton, the pedophilia, but, the super fantastic things that are attributed to them. And those sentiments at a time of uncertainty are very powerful and play on people's subconscious, and they create a community when there is not a lot of community. And in the absence of equal forces to counter them and to allay those anxieties, I think that that is how I would answer your first question. We're going to see more hardening of borders before we see opening of them, unfortunately. And then I guess do you want to speak to?
Yeah, well, I'll just, there's a number of my students here tonight, and we from 2 different classes, and I think we're spending like the entire semester trying to answer that question because it's a complex question. But I think there are some important factors for us to remember. One is, and this I think speaks to some of Allyson's point, is it's lazy and easy. If you're a politician, you don't have to have a platform or imagination or anything. This is a ready-made thing that has been around for a very long time to blame problems on the other. And unfortunately, it is too easy, and people are not held to account often enough for that. So I think that's one really critical dynamic. But the other is, you mentioned in your comment, you said robo-dogs. And that's another part of this, that there is enormous amounts of money to be made in the world of both border security and migrant detention. If you look in the United States, within the top 3 employers in all of the southern border states, so if you look in California, if you look in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, one of the top 3 employers in all those states is private detention companies. The other one that is in the top 3 are military-industrial complex companies who are increasingly involved in developing things like robo-dogs, like border surveillance things, like apps for people to self-deport themselves, biometrics, the whole range of these things. There are enormous trade shows that up until last year, the US government would never openly kind of attend and kind of host, but now they do. Now DHS effectively hosts these events, and people from all over the world come. So this is something that is sadly expanding as well. And so I think there's a political economy to it, unfortunately, too. And the more that happens, the more there is something to be lost for all those actors. And that's very sad and makes the challenge that much harder. Because it's not only a politics that we're challenging, it's a lot of money.
And it's largely located in London, in Canada. We had a huge military convention here 2 months ago, and we have more than 50 different military corporations, producers in this region, and so it's an epicenter for this kind of equipment. I don't want to end on a sad note. We were talking hope here. Sure.
Hi, sorry. I used to be on the refugee committee at my church, so I was just wondering what kind of role do you think religious institutions outside of like universities and things like that could do to like promote kids going into post-secondary education or support them in terms of getting into post-secondary education? Because our role was strictly in terms of settlement and acclimatization and things like that. So, yeah.
I'll just pop up there and say, well, King's, one of the things King's does really well is, I think, mostly well, We have support networks for first and family students who come here, and I think that that's really important. I think that there are probably also, and this is how it worked before when we had the WISC program, was that there were support networks of students that worked with refugee students who were attending school here. To the other part of your question about how do you encourage them, I do think that that has to come from the community, whether it's the school they attend in secondary or the families that are providing support to them. I think that it is very scary for some people to come to school. And without opening up more conversations, but particularly if you're from a culture that is quite different from North America or European cultures, and if you have sartorial differences where the clothing that you wear makes your otherness stand out more, I think that those are things that we really need to work as a university community to be able to provide the supports for that. We haven't had to do a tremendous amount of that work in the past.
So as we bring our Veritas lecture to an end, I have the pleasure of giving some closing remarks. My name is Mark Jensen, and I am the interim vice president and academic dean at King's. And I want to just offer a few notes of appreciation, some things that really struck me in the presentation from Drs. Muller and Larkin this evening. So I want to thank you, first of all, for representing King's in a global network in Rome with these other universities, and not just representing King's, but bringing your own expertise that we saw highlighted tonight to those conversations. And this represents something that's really important to King's, to be part of a global network of institutions committed, as Dr. Hannah said, to the pursuit of truth and justice and the common good. So thank you for that, and thank you for bringing back the richness of that encounter to our community. I'm really struck by how this presentation tonight has brought together people from across different sectors, not just within our King's community, but through the wider community, how it's something that we do together. And we see even the way we talk about interdisciplinarity was really emphasized here tonight, drawing on history, politics, philosophy, even theology, to engage this conversation and come to kind of concrete ways forward. Dr. Hannah referred to and eloquently described Catholic social teaching at the beginning of our evening, and it's sometimes said that Catholic social teaching is the untapped or secret, best kept secret of the Catholic tradition. And you've done a beautiful job of unpacking it here tonight, not just in its principles or its theory, but in its embodiment. And as a set of practices, that engage in collaboration and cooperation with people across traditions and across disciplines and cultures. My background is as a theologian, and I was reminded of a Veritas lecture that we had last year with Dr. Peter Phan, who talked about the migrant God. God as migrant. In the Christian tradition, in the Jewish tradition, we could say in the great monotheistic traditions, a God who travels with, a God who crosses borders. And so for those faith traditions, this is like the ground of our existence is migrant, is grounded in migration, but because of that is also grounded in solidarity. And that means that those of those traditions, as others, I think it's a vision of being human, are grounded in this movement of migration and solidarity, and that responsibility is not an extra, it's actually an existential responsibility. And so thank you for reminding us of that tonight as well. And emphasizing that, as Dr. Muller pointed out, this is not something that's simply happening elsewhere. This is something that deeply affects our own communities, our own neighborhoods, our own families, and it's not something that we can withdraw from. It concerns us. It's not somewhere else. And so we've been challenged tonight to overcome that culture of maybe indifference or maybe sometimes a sense of powerlessness. And I was struck that even in our questions, we had certain paths or hints of further conversations that we can have and actions that we can take. And tonight's presentation was a challenge to us as a university. And I also sit on the Planning and Priorities Committee at King's. And a challenge to all of us. It implicates us all. It implicates leaders and administrators, faculty, staff, students. It implicates us all and calls us to challenging modes of being ethical, of being responsible at a time when, yes, universities feel constrained, we're concerned about budgets, but what are responsibilities to each other? So again, I want to voice my deep appreciation for this presentation, Allyson and Ben. Thank you so much for challenging us tonight. And I want to thank all of you for being here, and I wish you a safe home. Thank you.